I'm going to present a systematic review on the effects of vocational and business training on women's labor market outcomes. This is joint work with a team from American Institutes for Research and the Grupo de Análisis para el Desarrollo in Peru. So my co-authors, Marjorie Chinnen, Lorena Alcazar, Maria Ballarin, and Josh Sennett, I would like to thank them all, as well as TRIAE for the support and the Campbell collaboration as well for publishing this review. So I'm going to just start with presenting you the way a usual traditional systematic review would have been perfectly reasonable to present, like say a decade ago. I would even say this would have been like super innovative in international development to present a systematic review with a forest plot on the effects of a specific development intervention on a specific development outcome, in this case, vocational and business training on women's labor market outcomes. So just for you, those of you who have never seen a forest plot, it basically shows from a wide diversity of studies, it shows the weighted average effect as well as the distribution of those effects across studies. And in this case, we're looking at the effect of vocational training on employment outcomes in low and middle income countries, several studies from sub-Saharan Africa, several studies from Latin America. And the real big strength of these forest plots is that not only can you see whether individual studies are having positive effects and what the size of those effects are, but you can also see whether on average these studies, and as well as the distribution, have a statistically significant effect. And the lines basically show the statistical significance, the confidence intervals of these effect sizes. And if you look at all these individual studies, you will see that almost none of these, despite positive coefficients, have statistically significant effects. But if you look at the meta-analysis in general, you will see that they are smallish, but statistically positive, statistically significant effects of vocational training on employment outcomes. And specifically, we find that the odds of employment increase with 1.18 for women. So this is like a basic finding of our systematic review. We do the same for income, and we find very similar findings where the effects of vocational training on income are 0.11 standardized mean differences on average. It's statistically significant effects. Not so much so for the individual studies, but globally, yes, these programs have statistically significant effects, small but positive, on women's labor market outcomes. So I could now just walk away and say this was my presentation, but generally, TRIAE and the common consensus on systematic reviews in international development is that we just go beyond this. Because it's not really clear what we can learn from this, because like what should we now do with these vocational and business training programs? Should we just continue? We don't know, because even if these effects are there, are they cost effective? It's unclear, like these programs are very expensive, but we don't have the cost data for them, but we still see these positive effects. So what should we really do? And like, I mean, a TRIAE conference would not be complete with at least one presentation where this slide is shown. So we're going to take a look at the theory of change and actually look at this place in the middle, like what is actually going on with these vocational and business training programs, these intermediate outcomes, but even more so, even like we're going a little bit back, what is actually happening? Whom of you actually knows what a vocational and business training program is? I will probably get 30 different answers from this audience on what that actually means, because there are so many different program components here for vocational and business training. So we start with a basic theory of change, and I'm going to look at this more closely later, but basically what this theory of change shows, and I'm sure you will not all be able to read this, but intermediate outcomes is that the employability of these people increases, they obtain knowledge on how to operate on the labor market, either as an entrepreneur for business training, but in this presentation I will primarily focus on vocational training, and for vocational training, Similarly, knowledge increases, practices increases, but what does that really mean for employment outcomes? That's the ultimate goal of this program. So to look at these phases in between, what we're doing is we are expanding on the usual research questions in a systematic review. So in addition to looking at the effects of these vocational and business training programs, we're also looking at the barriers and facilitators of vocational and business training program effectiveness. And in addition, we're also looking at program design and implementation characteristics that are associated. There are no causal conclusions here with stronger positive effects of these programs. And basically the journey that we're taking here on this systematic review is that difficult because programs are often not very well described in impact evaluation studies. We first look at the detailed program characterization of all these studies. So we look at what vocational and business training actually means. Do they include like life skills training? And we go into the nitty-gritty as much as possible, where we basically ask, like, if there's vocational training, like, does that mean that on Wednesday they have a 2-hour training on the 1st of April of 2015? Or does that mean that they have a training on Wednesday and Friday in March 2014? And these kinds of things are usually not described in impact evaluation studies. And you will see that also we don't have this information for many of these studies. Based on that, we come up with hypotheses that we can then test in further meta-analysis, like basically the essence of a mixed method systematic review. I'm going to really briefly talk about the number of program documents we looked for this, so we go beyond just looking at impact evaluation studies. Instead, we found like 93 program documents that really describe either in a process evaluation way or just on a website even, or just a program document from an organization of what these programs actually do, how they are implemented in practice, and basically what are the program characteristics of these specific vocational training programs that are being implemented. And in addition to that, we really look at 50 qualitative studies. Oftentimes, the quantitative studies that we included also include minor qualitative information, so we also include those. And in addition to that, that's not shown on this sheet, the effect sizes are based on 35 experimental and quasi-experimental studies on vocational and business training program. So this, based on that, we use qualitative synthesis techniques, so a narrative meta-synthesis, to basically determine the barriers and facilitators toward the effectiveness of these programs. And we link these to the theory of change. We already identified several of these barriers and facilitators in the design phase of this systematic review. We identified them in the protocol phase. And we basically examined whether in a wide variety of settings, these kinds of barriers are actually prevalent in determining the effectiveness of these programs. And what we found is basically that the distance to the training center and costs often prevent women from actually attending vocational training programs. Depending on the context, was most prevalent in Jordan actually this, for example, but in several other settings we also found that this was also the case. In addition to that, several women are being prevented from participating in vocational and business training programs because of household chores tasks that they have to pursue, as well as availability of childcare, which is often not available in low and middle income countries, and limited mobility. Some women don't get permission from their family members, for example, to actually attend vocational and business training programs, even if they themselves want to. So what can we learn from this in terms of hypothesis is that possibly these programs are actually becoming more effective if we address these barriers and For example, through life skills training, offering courses at times compatible with women's schedule, and an overall design that addresses gender norms. So breaking down occupational segregation and discrimination on the labor market. And all these are hypotheses, and the qualitative synthesis suggests, but not in a representative sample, that all these barriers are critical and that programs such as this could actually make vocational and business training programs more effective. So we moved back to the quantitative research now to actually rigorously test this again in a meta-analysis. So just for you to know, like, The below studies are all focusing on vocational training programs that do not include this specific focus on gender norms and that do not take into consideration all these gender norms and how important they are for women's chances on the labor market. And we find that these programs have positive effects on employment, but at the same time, these effects are relatively small, 1.18 odds. When we look at the upper chart, which really consists of these studies that focus on gender norms and that explicitly take this into consideration in the program design, we see that the effects suddenly become a lot larger. And there have been lots of concerns about the costs of vocational training programs, but possibly, though we're missing the cost data here, vocational training programs could possibly become more cost-effective as a result of including these characteristics that are really associated with transgressing gender norms, basically, on the labor market. And we find something very similar for business training and profits. We also find that their life skills really ensure that business training becomes more effective in increasing profits for entrepreneurs that are participating in business training programs. Don't have the time to go into detail into the business training. Basically, these are the conclusions of this presentation. On average, both vocational and business training have small but positive effects, nothing spectacular but positive on women's labor market outcomes, unsurprisingly. And one critical finding here is that they are also larger when programs explicitly take into consideration gender norms in their programming. So just a couple of reflections to finish this. Basically what we're learning here is that gender norms could, or that including these kind of components could possibly make these programs more effective, but we have not tested it actually through either randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental studies. There could be confounding factors here, specific contextual characteristics that are linked to these gender norms. So systematic reviews can really inform future research. It will be critical to actually design impact evaluations in the future that really look at these specific components and see whether vocational and business training become more effective in a more rigorous manner. And in addition to that, and which is critical, I would say, in the end, systematic reviews were really limited. In the end, we did not find whether women got training on women on Wednesday at 4 p.m. We only knew very vaguely from program documents what actually happened in these interventions. Maybe one of the key lessons here, and this is what we're trying to currently incorporate in one of our existing studies for the impact evaluations on education programs in humanitarian settings, is that from the start of these impact evaluations, we already think about the synthesis of all these studies, and we try to start with this program characterization from the beginning of these impact evaluations to inform future systematic reviews. And in addition to that, you hear my caution about cost effectiveness. I cannot say anything conclusively at this point. Synthesizing cost data is probably going to be critical in the future for these impact evaluations. Increasingly, impact evaluations take them into consideration, but the current evidence does not include a lot of cost effectiveness analysis yet. So thanks very much.